Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined the session. This is the latest in our series of webinars around our book, Aftershocks and Opportunities, Scenarios for a Post-Pandemic Future. As a reminder, really encourage you all to ask questions of the panelists in the Q&A section and to vote for the questions you'd most like to see answered. And if you have any comments, please pop those into the chat section and make sure that you address those to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the points you're making. Let me just, while we're waiting for a few more people to join, let me just give you a little reminder of who's here and the format for tonight. Sorry, 1 second, bit of a technical glitch there. Stop sharing. Yeah, so this evening session, or this afternoon session, or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. For some reason, sorry, this is not accepting the slides that I'm trying to display for some reason. Let's try again. Okay, there you go. So this afternoon session is on government and economy. And we have an excellent panel today with David Wood, Geoff Mulgan, Bronwyn Williams, and myself sharing the content of some of our chapters. And the session is actually going to be moderated by Steve Wells, who's one of the co-editors on the book. Just a reminder, some of you tend to leave by the end, so just a reminder that if you're interested in learning more about our future webinars and getting the videos of the events that we run, there is a So this has gone on to show. Anyway, there's a link there. I'll show it again at the end. And there's the book. So let me stop and hand straight over to Steve for a far smoother running of the rest of the session.
Thank you very much indeed, Rohit, and a warm welcome to this webinar from me as well. As Rohit said, one of the co-editors on the book. Before we get into the introductions from each of our panelists this afternoon, I just wanted to start us off by launching a poll. And one of the things that we have focused on, particularly at the start of the book, is trying to put some of the potential of a post-pandemic world into the context of some scenarios. So we've got here in this poll the headlines of those scenarios, and we've got two questions associated with them. And if you can consider your answers to these as we have the panelists introducing themselves, then we'll look back at that poll in a little while. So the first question is, of the 4 scenarios that we've answered, and I think they're pretty self-explanatory from the headlines that we have here. Which scenario do you think is most likely for your country between now and the end of 2022? And the second question is, which scenario are you personally doing the most preparation for? So the second question again, which of the scenarios are you most preparing for? And the first question then is, which scenario do you think is most likely for your country? So whilst you're thinking about that and compiling your responses, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves for around about 30 seconds. So first of all, let me invite David to introduce himself. David, over to you.
It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's David Wood. I chair London Futurists. I've been a futurist of a sort for about 30 years, from when I was working in the mobile computing and smartphone industry, anticipating the future of that business. And nowadays, I'm very happy to join this wider community of people who are thinking about all aspects of radical futures.
David, thank you very much, and looking forward to the highlights from your chapter a little bit later on. Secondly, let me ask Bronwyn. Bronwyn, if you can introduce yourself, please. Welcome to the stage.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you are today. My name is Bronwyn Williams. I'm a partner with Flux Trends. We are a boutique consulting company that deals with the intersection of trends and futures and foresight for corporate companies. My personal background is in marketing and economics, so I kind of overlap on those two areas. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about my chapter on the Great Separation.
Excellent, lovely. Thanks very much indeed, Bronwyn. And next, I'm delighted to introduce Geoff Mulgan. Geoff, if you can introduce yourself, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Geoff Mulgan. I'm a professor at University College London with a background working for various governments around the world, mainly in the UK, also in academia, philanthropy, and in technology. My background is in telecommunications.
Excellent, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Geoff. And last but not least, for anyone that doesn't know Rohit Talwar, Rohit, if you can give us 30 seconds on you, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rohit Talwar. I'm the CEO of Fast Future and one of the editors of the book. And I'll be talking to you today about a couple of chapters that we wrote around the future of government and some of the big global economic challenges that we see lying ahead. And I just want to apologize to the people who are having sound problems. This is an issue with Zoom at the moment where some people hear perfectly, others don't. Sometimes if you have headsets in, if you take them out, then it's better listening through your computer, but I can't explain why it is that we've got such a wide range of sound quality issues across Zoom, with some having perfect sound and others not being able to hear at all. It's beyond our knowledge of Zoom to be able to explain why that is, but hopefully it'll get better. And we as panelists will all mute ourselves, and Steve as chair will mute himself when anyone else is speaking. Hopefully that will make it a little bit better as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Rohit. So let's take a quick look at the poll, shall we, at the moment, just to see where we've gone. Let me share the results of that poll. So in terms of which the scenarios do you think is the most likely for your country between now and the end of 2022, then the VIP economy, a poorly contained pandemic, and a vibrant economic rebound seems to be the most popular option, closely followed by safe but hungry, an eradication of the pandemic with a deep and prolonged downturn. The second question then was, which of these are you personally doing the most to prepare for? And I think statistically we can call that a dead heat, which I think is quite interesting, that there's many people preparing for those two least popular scenarios are thinking that they need to do something to prepare for those. Are there any, out of interest, any immediate thoughts from anyone on the panel about those results?
I'll go first if you like. I'm interested that the VIP economy seems to have risen up again. Last week it dropped down a bit. We're testing this every week. And what's interesting is it certainly seems to be the case that everywhere we're testing this right now, people seem to think that that's where their country is. This acceptance that we're going to crack on with dealing with the pandemic, with getting the economy moving, but we'll accept that there is a problem that with the pandemic itself that we're just going to live with. And you certainly see that in the US. Over half of the US states have now got rising infection levels again. And I think this is going to be the story until we get a vaccine, that countries are just going to live with it. And we've heard India and a number of other countries, Brazil, basically saying that that's their strategy now, and just accepting there is going to be a human cost to this.
Thank you, Rohit. Any other thoughts from anyone on the panel?
Well, my worry is that alongside the human cost, the more human cost, the more the economy will be costed too. So I actually gave my vote in each case for the first of the four scenarios, the long goodbye, because I do see the trend you're noticing that people are saying, well, we can't fight this anymore, we're just going to have to live with it. And they're giving up on measures of lockdown and social distancing. And I am very fearful for what that will open up, what second or third waves may come. So I'm currently getting ready for a potential long period of economic downturn and a long period of health risks. Though I think humanity will fight back in the end, but it's probably going to get significantly worse before we get significantly better. I wish I'm wrong in that, but I want to be ready for that probability.
Yeah, I was going to say something a bit similar. I think the option number 2 probably isn't very sustainable in the in even the medium term, let alone the long term. And you can already see the countries you've cited which have followed that strategy. Public support for their leaders is waning, whether for Trump, even more for Bolsonaro and others. And my guess is that will turn out not to be a viable sort of position to take, either because of actually the health effects on the economy, which David said, but also in terms of political leadership. So I think that at the moment looks accurate for large parts of the world, but it's probably hard to see how that can continue for more than a few months.
Thanks, Geoff. Bronwyn, any thoughts from you?
I suppose that from where I sit, sitting in a country like South Africa, where life is already stratified, and I think we're going to talk a bit more about that later, and that's somehow different parts of all those scenarios could be playing out. I don't think it's going to be as simple as either fixing all the economic problems or dealing with the health issues. And I don't think that matrix works out quite as nicely as it did perhaps a couple of months back when we first started thinking about this. Because I'm definitely seeing that our society is being re-stratified, and certain areas are definitely now bouncing back from economic factors, but other parts of the economy have been permanently depressed, which is really what I've been looking at here. This crisis is not a crisis that affects everyone in the same way. When we talk about the health aspects of it, I think what's been underreported is the long-term side effects or side effect health issues that are coming about more from other chronic illnesses, the illnesses that really do kill the vast majority of human beings. That's illnesses like heart disease and like cancers that are essentially being kicked down the road a little bit. So I think we're hiding some of those figures in the total numbers of what's going to come out of this and the real effects going on there. I'm looking at it from an insurance point of view or from a medical care point of view. The costs of deferred care on societies, both from economic factors and from health factors, is something we're only going to see a lag effect in a good 3, 4, 5 years down the line. I mean, like even where I am, there's already been 12,000 urgent cancer surgeries that have been cancelled. And that was just within the first month of us going into lockdown. So that's going to catch up with us. That's not going to go anywhere else.
That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for just commenting on those polls. Okay, so if we take the poll away for now, and I'd like to invite David back to the stage, please. David, who's going to give us a perspective on his chapter, More Aware, More Agile, More Alive. David, over to you.
Many thanks. So as you just heard, my chapter is called More Aware, More Agile, More Alive. And I try to answer 3 questions in this. Why aren't we more aware of the large risks and, yes, the large opportunities that lie ahead? Why do we often get taken by surprise by these disruptions? Second, even where we are aware of them, why are we left flat-footed? Why don't we break out of the inertia, and why aren't we more agile to take advantage of that anticipation? And the most important question is, rather than just what's wrong, how can we make things better? What actions can we take now to prepare to do better with these disruptions when they arise in the future? And by the way, there will be a test at the end of my remarks, and the test consists of that question there. I'll be asking you to vote on various possible actions, so you might listen out for that. Some of you may have seen cartoons of the following sort, which depict society paying attention to the current panic, COVID-19. And in this picture, the leader of this country says, "Be sure to wash your hands and all will be well." But the cartoonist points out there are actually bigger risks in the frame too, which we need to pay attention to, such as a recession, climate change. You might want to add your own waves in here, a possible second worse wave of COVID-19, a terrible wave of trauma due in the UK to a no-deal Brexit, for example. There is also a variant on this picture drawn by the German commentator Alexander Krull, who adds in the risks of bioterrorism. Just imagine what this person in Reading in the UK did yesterday. For those of you who don't know, he took a knife and killed 3 people. If he had access to bioweapons, how much worse that would have been, and possibly also artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not here today to debate which of these waves are actually the biggest and most dangerous. That is an important discussion, but what we need to get to first is to raise people's attention to the fact that there are lots of waves coming. And they're coming for 4 reasons. First, because we are more interconnected than ever before. We are therefore vulnerable as a global civilization to lots of contagions, biological contagions, financial contagions, malware contagions, fake news contagions. We are also having more and more powerful technology all the time, the nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognotech, which builds a stronger connectivity, but also increases the power of the payloads, which can be transmitted around the world. We have, third, growing imbalances with the environment, with all kinds of weather problems and other environmental problems. And we have imbalances within society as a whole. More inequality, more perceived inequality, more partisanship and rivalry and tribalism. In short, we have more strength and we have more intelligence because of our technology, but we don't have greater wisdom to match, which is why we are likely to have lots of disruption ahead. So why aren't we ready for these disruptions? Why do they take us by surprise? What's being shown here is from 2009. This is the Queen of UK and the Commonwealth, Queen Elizabeth, being shown by a professor in the London School of Economics their methods for managing that credit crunch. This was opening a new building in the LSE, and the Queen asked a question: why no one of you wonderful economists had predicted this credit crunch? And after quite a long delay, the assembled academics and professors wrote back to the Queen and said, yes, we were misled by a feel-good factor. We had a psychology of denial that gripped the financial and political world, and we overtrusted apparent financial wizards who managed to convince everybody that we were very clever and there was no longer any risks. So I take all of that as indicating the problems are not so much in logic, but in human psychology or even human sociology. I actually list 6 reasons why risks lack sufficient attention, and here I'll start moving into solution mode as well. The first problem is this psychological issue that we tend to be over-optimistic. People are told, don't rock the boat, and we don't like noticing ugly elephants in the room. Partly we try and convince ourselves they don't really exist, and when they do exist, we still prefer to talk about something else. To respond to this, I think we need what I call credible, constructive pessimism. Credible in the sense of nobody can deny what we're drawing attention to. Constructive in the sense of pointing out solutions too. Then we have the problem that many of us think linearly and think in binary black and white when we need to learn more about exponentials and probabilities, in which small disruptions can suddenly escalate to much larger ones. Then there's the issue that so much of society is organized around short-term, 5-year election cycles, quarterly business reports. I do believe we need to appoint more people to be champions for the future, a cabinet minister for the future, perhaps. And then there's a more complicated reason, which is that risk mitigation is a public good. Everybody benefits from efforts put into anticipating risks. So why is that a problem? It's a problem because every individual is loath to bear the cost alone. Companies don't like doing this kind of fundamental research because they want themselves benefit. Now, it's long been understood that the solution to this kind of issue is politics. Governments can take actions on behalf of the whole society. But there's a deeper issue here, which is that many of these risks are no longer national, they are international. Therefore, we need to raise the level of analysis and mitigation to the international level, and many people are terrified of such an idea. They hate the concept of world government or EU alliances. They talk about lack of sovereignty as a terrible crime. Well, the answer to this is reasonably well known too. We have to re-establish the case for government. We have to emphasize the benefits of a powerful state, which is controlled by a powerful society of interlocking other mechanisms, formal and informal. Finally, there's the risks that people are afraid of measures that might avoid risks because they're afraid that they will leave their own countries behind. And no country wants to be left behind in a race to develop better biotech or better AI. And to answer this, we need to really up the game of our risk management framework. I call this more generally a global future management framework. I don't have time to talk much about this. It requires more serious pooling of insights from multiple disciplines to come up with scenarios in which we address the two great questions of future studies: which of the scenarios are credible, which of them are desirable, and often in both cases the answers are different to what people first expect. As well as anticipating, we need better constant monitoring of things that are different from what we expected. And this is going to require more of us to be honest in our assessments of what's happening. There's too much of a tendency to cover up inconvenient issues because they seem to fit poorly with our own ideology, or they might reflect badly on our own organization. We need much more of a spirit of openness and transparency, which I think needs to be helped along by carrots and sticks. We need surely a rapid response capability, which is more than just reserve storage, because we can't have extra storage for everything, extra capacity, but we do need agile systems. And arguably, one of the most important skills to teach people is that of agility, which is not just a buzzword. Finally, this cannot be done individually. It will require international funding. And the possible good news is that just as after the Second World War, new international organizations were founded, if there is suitable international leadership, we might get new organizations. And it's going to require excellent ongoing communications, which are vivid and credible and open. We need new kinds of communications, a bit like that which persuaded these two politicians to set aside some of their former divisions and antagonisms by pointing out that they were both on a course of possible, not just the nuclear bombs going off, but possibly the whole world being destroyed by a nuclear winter. That futurist, missing from this picture, but if I Photoshop him in, Carl Sagan, pointed out the dangers in a very credible and constructive way of a nuclear winter, and helped to change the world from a headlong rush into more and more nuclear weapons into quite a significant change. We need more people like that today. And there, I'll draw my remarks to a close. Thanks for listening. I think if we set these things in place, we can have not just avoiding terrible futures, we can also grasp the possibility for much better solutions from these same NBIC technologies.
David, thank you very much indeed for those thoughts. Let's start off this part of the session by launching your poll. So hopefully you can all see the poll on your screen now. So David's question is: to improve our readiness for future risks and opportunities, which actions deserve most attention in the next 24 months? And this is multiple choice. So I won't go through each of the options. You can read those through on the screen. What I'd like to do first of all is just get the panelists' immediate reactions to what David has just spoken about whilst people are looking at and responding to the poll. Who'd like to go first?
I suppose I can jump in. I think that one of the best ideas came out of that was, of course, this idea of having future advocates, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And we're starting to see some of those roots taking place. I know that there was one parliament that's actually now got a minister for future generations. So that's quite encouraging. We are looking in that direction. And I know that Australia has now started putting actually foresight and future studies type knowledge modules into their education for their school children. So I think that the world is waking up to that way of doing things. But I suppose where I would part ways from David is that I think that the biggest problems that we've seen is that we don't have enough individual agency. And I think that I can see that very clearly in the way that different countries have responded to what's happened this year, and how countries that have encouraged individual agency, and I'm looking here particularly like countries like Japan, where there is a sense of social responsibility within the individual, are much better prepared than countries that are deferring to authority to solve their problems. So I think that where I part ways from David is that he's saying that perhaps we need a bigger government and we need bigger institutions and stronger institutions. I would like to turn that on its head and say we rather need more responsible individuals that are not prepared to outsource basic responsibilities to a higher power. And I think that we've really seen over this year the limits of big government and how countries that have tried to impose laws and very strict lockdowns have failed very quickly. We all know that where the virus came from and the fact that that came from a very top-down society that was still able to escape into the general world. And I think also looking once again at like your real disaster countries at the moment, like the US and what's going on there, they've sort of dabbled with big government and lack of big government. And we've really just seen that trying to impose these laws just doesn't work. You can't really have this rule by law in a very big, very complicated, very globalized world. The only way we're going to solve our problems is if more individuals are thinking about the consequences of their own actions rather than deferring to the collective. And I think collectivism is pretty much at the root of the biggest problems that we're seeing today. The rises of populism on pretty much every side of the political spectrum point to this fact that collectivism needs to be balanced out by strong individual responsibility. That would be my 2 cents.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. Geoff, Rohit?
Well, maybe helpfully, I totally disagree with everything Bronwyn just said. So I think, you know, I can understand why one would like to believe that, but I think the evidence so far is those governments which have imposed laws have been quite draconian and not relied only on individual responsibility, have done much better than those which have been weak all over the place and have sort of hoped for goodwill or individuals doing what they can do. I mean, big risks like this, pandemics, financial crises, are risks it's very hard for the individual to deal with on their own. So we have to rely on collective capabilities to deal with them, and those governments and those countries which have strong collective capabilities will have done well out of this crisis. Those with weak ones, or which have relied on populist and other ideologies, will have seen very high deaths and a high economic cost. So I think, in fact, my guess is this crisis will lead to a bit of a shift away from exactly the kind of sentiments Bronwyn just expressed. But who knows? We'll find out.
Well, I am a fan personally of individual responsibilities, and I think there is scope for people being reminded of what they can do themselves. But I do think there are a certain class of problems which individuals themselves cannot cope with. And in terms of the comparison with China, I would point out that China actually failed to respect their whistleblower in the start. They covered up. They did not practice the methods which I was advocating, and they paid the price for that. So I'm not just asking for a strong state. I'm asking for a strong society in which there is a free media, in which there is an opposition, in which there is a strong legal systems, and it's out of that collective strong state and strong society that we're going to be likely to be able to take control of these risks.
Rohit, any thoughts?
If I could follow through on what everyone has been saying. I think that the bit that's missing for me at the moment is around capacity, whether that's government, organizations, or individuals. And you know, David's chapter is brilliant and it's really well argued, but it relies on a couple of things. It relies on governments having the capacity to manage the delivery of these technologies and make good choices. And whilst we're seeing some governments that have really got their act together, I think, you know, when you look at the details of how Taiwan has organized itself, and Singapore to some extent, they're incredible case studies in terms of governments using foresight and really thinking through how you put in place the mechanisms to deal with all this. And so the one is the capacity at government level. The next is the organization's ability to do this. And I'm quite scared, a bit like David was earlier, that there are so many businesses today just asking for a kind of blind return to business without really paying any attention to the health risks or how we manage the long-term risks. And it's a lack of understanding, a lack of skills, a lack of foresight maybe. And then again, I think David's arguments are sort of predicated on society having a much higher level of digital literacy, society having a much broader understanding of the issues we're talking about, and people being better trained and better able to make decisions with imperfect information or under uncertainty. And we certainly don't have that. And I think the UK is becoming a great case study for what happens when you don't have that capability at all three levels. You end up with this cacophonous mess that we have now. And when government ministers are standing up and saying, now is not the time to be learning lessons, you really panic, because on the one hand, they herald the army and the army's ability to manage in a crisis. And yet the army is built on this notion of rapid inaction and after action review, so that in the middle of a conflict, you might change strategy and tactics 6 or 7 times, not because you're incompetent, but because new learning is coming in and you're adapting to that. And I would say that, you know, we're witnessing in a number of governments a huge inability to adapt. And so in order for David's kind of vision of the world to play out, I think the precursor to that is a massive upgrading in capability, which I don't see happening. If anything, in a lot of cases, I see that getting worse, both in certain governments, but also in society, as people become more narrowly focused on just their survival, rather than learning the skills for the longer term. And that's where, you know, for example, the chapter in the book about Morgan Kaufman's chapter about this is not a drill, you know, rehearsing for the pandemic every 2 years, is all about that education of society and building societal capability to deal with these broader risks. And I think that's a massive gap at the moment that we have to address if we want things to be better.
I think we do have a lot of latent capacity. The military has great capacity, and they were set up to manage some kinds of risks, the risks of foreign invasions. We need to reroute some of that capacity onto other things. We had a lot of capacity in companies turning their focus from what they traditionally manufactured to possibly manufacturing ventilators and PPE. But no, I take it that we still aren't agile enough, which is why I put as one of the highest priorities, we must all go on a crash course on what it means to be agile and how to cope with more rapid change and more rapid learning.
Well, thank you for those thoughts, everyone. I just shared the results of the poll. So, David, interested to get your thoughts. I think I just want to squeeze one delegate question in as well before we go. If we carry on like this, we're going to be here until midnight. So we probably need to focus a bit more on some of the specifics here. So what are your thoughts on the poll there? It seems like tech everyone, the skills of agility and identify and support future advocates seem by a long way the most popular choices in your poll. What are your thoughts?
Well, I certainly think these are good answers. Slightly disappointed the bottom two don't have more people voting for them as well. Maybe they were too far down the list and people got tired before they reached that part of the poll. I think we need to be much better at communicating and inspiring people to take responsibility and take the right action. And we do need to emphasize truth matters, objectivity matters. We should not allow people to get off with passing around stuff that they no longer believe. The government's actions in hiding so many things recently are a national scandal, and we should not let them get away with it. So I would have preferred to see that last one have a higher rating as well, but maybe another day.
So I just want to pick up one question that has been posed, and it's from Max Ramsahoy, and he says, what main flaws of our global civilization stroke socio-economic system does the pandemic expose, and what measures or even alternative systems could prevent pandemics and more severe global catastrophic or existential risks? I hesitate to say, what are your 60-second thoughts on a question like that? But if you could do your best, that'd be great, David.
So the simple answer is we need to deepen our collective understanding of the role of politics and of the role of economics. There are far too many people with simplistic ideas of both. There are dangerous pro-market fundamentalists, there are dangerous anti-market fundamentalists. There are people who are dangerous anti-government fundamentalists as well. We need to clarify something that has been understood in the past, but which is pushed out by too many simple slogans, the core benefits of the mixed economy and of a society in which there is both a strong state and a strong society. Without that understanding, as a very minimum, we're very unlikely to be able to organize ourselves constructively for a better future. You're muted, Steve. Steve, you're muted.
It doesn't help when the host does that, does it? I wanted to thank everyone for their insights, and it just goes to show the complexity and uncertainty when members of the panel can come at these questions from totally different ends. That was wonderful, I think. So thank you very much indeed, David. I'd like to hand the stage over now to Bronwyn. Bronwyn, very much welcome you to the stage, and you're going to talk about the Great Separation. Over to you. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So basically the way I approached this chapter that I put together was looking at it from what's really happening underneath with what's going on in the world. And I think that with most crises, in fact, with really all crises, they tend to amplify existing cracks and fissures in our society, and they also tend to accelerate trends that are already in play. And obviously, if that to focus on something, I decided to look at what's going on here, in particular with the fissures and cracks that have been amplified by what has happened by this crisis. So I really think that when this quote by ABBA really sums up my opinion of what's going to happen on the other side of that, and this whole concept of the winner takes it all. I think when the news broke what was going on with COVID in like early January, when I started picking up the story, there were a lot of people saying this is going to be a global crisis. This is going to be something that we're all in together, wherever in the world we are, whichever part of social strata we're in, the virus does not discriminate against different people. It's going to affect us all. And I think that there's a bit of truth in that, but there's more truth in the fact that what COVID and what 2020 have really shown for us is the massive cracks, the massive missing middle ground within various different strata of our society. I mean, I don't have to really tell you what's going on in the world with the massive protests going on and how they are accelerating and amplifying a lot of divisions and a lot of conflicts that have lain unaddressed, sometimes for many, many generations. So I think this metaphor of the missing middle ground can be applied both literally and figuratively. Figuratively in the sense of the amplified conflicts between different groups of society, whether you're talking about different political groups, different generational cohorts, we'll get into a little bit later, or just different ways of viewing the world, even like as we're debating today. It's really asking people to take sides on various different issues that people have been able to bypass for some time to come. However, there's also a missing middle ground or a missing middle in a much more literal sense, in that particularly for the Western world, for the developed world with that ED on the end. What we really see, what's going to come out in terms of the economic effects of this crisis, is increased pressure on what was formerly the middle class as we know it. That's not to say that people aren't now living middle class lifestyles, but rather I'm talking about that sort of missing middle segment of society that I like to call the codependent class. This is the class that has to rely on trade, that is selling their labor, selling a product, getting involved with business in order to pay their way through life. And I consider this class to be slightly separate to, say, your very wealthy independent class who can live off assets or rents without actually having to trade in order to survive, and then segmented once again from the net dependent segment of society. That is people that are reliant on welfare or charity for their survival. And I think that what's happening now with a lot of the economic measures that have been put in place, a lot of the policies that have been chosen, and in the way that aid is being distributed throughout various strata of society, I think that our missing middle segment of our market is going to put a lot of pressure on society going forward as we find middle class people increasingly pushed into that dependent segment of society. And at the same time, we see a lot of freelancers say who didn't get their helicopter money when everyone else did, they're now having to fend for themselves. And what we really see here is we see vicious and virtuous circles taking place where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the middle of society in a literal and a figurative sense gets squeezed more and more. And we see more and more radical polarization on almost every aspect that we can look at society. So in the chapter, I go into a bit of detail on a couple of those divisions, just to sort of illustrate this bigger point that I think can apply to a lot of different dimensions of what's going on in the world at the moment. The first one would be what's happening in the business sphere when it comes to small businesses versus big businesses. And what we're seeing now is in terms of having countries going into lockdown, having economies essentially placed on pause, and seeing where once again that aid, that helicopter money is going. What's happening is your big businesses get bigger, they are able to buy up at basically bargain prices a lot of their smaller competitors. A lot of your mom and pop shops, your smaller middle class run businesses once again find themselves completely without cash runway. We've done research here where I live in South Africa, and I'm sure it's very similar across the different countries where you're all looking through today. And 3 out of 4 businesses don't believe they're going to make it through the lockdown period. Those would be your SMEs. And I've come from Africa. Africa is really going to be the future of the world and not too distant future. By 2050, 1 in 4 people, as we all know, is going to be African. And a lot of the hope for getting Africa out of the poverty trap and into that sort of middle income bracket was supposed to come from growth in small and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, that's pretty much the only plan my government has in terms of kickstarting jobs or getting the unemployment trend reversed in our country. And now, just within these 3 months, we've basically seen all those best laid plans really undone. Once again, seeing a lot of those middle segment businesses being forced to either go and try to find work, go back into the workforce, try to go work for one of their bigger competitors, or then on the other side, competing with the black market in the really informal side of the economy, where more and more people are finding themselves forced as those unemployment figures rise really dramatically, at least where I am based right now. And very similar to that, there's the divide, as I said, between the rich and the poor, and how the crisis affected these different strata of society. The poor are more exposed to the health aspects of the crisis and to the economic aspects. And at the same time, you get a lot of more wealthy people that are actually capitalizing on this and actually getting a lot richer. So, I mean, we all know that if you're not part of the Zoomer economy, that is being able to sort of apply your trade online, essentially you've been without work for 2, 3, 4, perhaps it's going to be up to 12 months, depending on how strict your country's laws are and how long the virus progresses for. So if you are based in a service industry, where a lot of the poorer people are, where like your entry-level workforces, a lot of your youth workers are, you're really finding your income entirely paused. And if your government isn't wealthy enough to do handouts and income covers and job guarantees and payroll sponsorship that a lot of the wealthier countries have been able to do, essentially those people who were just hanging on, that were just able to be financially independent, now being pushed back into dependency on the increasingly stressed and stretched state. And at the same time, though, the Zoomer class, as I like to call them, those people that are able to apply their trade online, are actually getting wealthier, because now you're able to trade in more different ways and you're scooping up more and more segments of the market. So we really see those vicious and virtuous circles at play, and it's really something we have to be concerned about, because we can see that almost all those protests going on around the world right now, as much as they are nominally about racism, and as important as that really is, what underlies those very, very deep issues is growing inequality, is this inability to get ahead in life. And as we start to see that divide between rich and poor become more and more insurmountable, that just makes society that much more fragile. And as been said by thinkers going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, that in order for a society or democratic society to be stable, you need a strong middle class, that is an independent class that's able to have reciprocal skin in the game, that is to share in the upside of the economy and not to be unduly hurt by downturns. And I think that we've really broken that social contract with the way we've tried to address this through policy challenges across the world. And very similar to that, the third divide that I'm really concerned about at the moment is the breakdown in the social contract between the young and the old. And here I'm talking really about the fact that as people's lives are getting longer, we're finding that younger generations are having to pay more into social welfare projects and that they're not necessarily going to get out at the end of their lives. We've seen this, it's been going on for many, many years, the growing divides between the millennial generation and the boomer generation, and their different political views. We all know what sort of ways the different generational cohorts tend to lean in terms of their politics. But this has really been just accelerated by what's happened in 2020, in that the consequences of COVID, of the policies that are being put into play, of the money printing, of the QE, of the MMT and all the rest of it, it affects the different generations differently, because many of those policies do involve turning a short, sharp shock into a longer, slower one that will be paid back by more hands over more time. And of course, then the health aspects of this particular virus do affect the different generational cohorts too. So of course, older people are more at risk physically, but perhaps younger people are more at risk financially with what's going to happen with this crisis. And that's going to once again increase the tension in these fault lines running through our societies right now. So that's the negative side of this, but I don't like to be too pessimistic when it comes to looking at the future. I do firmly believe that in the long run, humans' trajectory is going up. Unfortunately, they do tend to be some very severe dips along the way. But I think that our problem is that we are trying to turn short-term crises into long-term problems. And we've really got to start adjusting our time preference to a much longer time scale. And some things that when things do go wrong, crises do happen, I think that society's become quite spoiled into wanting very, very quick fixes rather than being prepared to put the work into fixing things properly, so that we're not just kicking cans down the road. We're not just pushing economic crises down onto the next generation and onto the next one thereafter. And also that we're not just putting band-aids on the health issues that have emerged from what's gone on with the pandemic. That we're not just trying to fix this issue, we're rather thinking about how we can prevent the next one. So I think that a lot of these issues, a lot of these divides can be solved by trying to think about intergenerational consumption smoothing and to think about intergenerational value creation, intergenerational fairness. So there's reciprocal skin in the game across the various different strata of society, whether you're looking at it from a horizontal perspective, that is between what's going on between the rich and the poor in the world at the moment, or from a vertical perspective, thinking across the generations as we go along. So that's a little bit of the highlights of what my chapter is about, but there is of course more in the book. Thank you. That's it from me for now.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bronwyn. So let me launch your poll. There we go. That should be on your screens now. So the question for Bronwyn through this poll is, which groups are likely to do best economically in the next 2 years compared to their situation at the end of 2019? And again, this is multiple choice. So do have a look at the poll, express your opinion through the poll. And while you're looking at that poll, let me just ask for some immediate reaction from the panel. Who wants to go first?
Go on, I will. Oh, go ahead, David.
Well, I think Bronwyn's raised some very important points. I think the risk of growing inequality needs to be taken more seriously than it is just now. People often shrug their shoulders and say, hey, these guys should just pull their socks up and they'll be fine. But as Bronwyn mentions, there are deep structural reasons which are leading to the winner taking it all, as in that ABBA song. There are mechanisms such as Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has highlighted with his equation R is greater than G, in which investment tends to do better than the normal growth of the economy. So if you've got money, you tend to get more money. And there are a whole bunch of other issues that the MIT economists Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee have identified for why the winner will take more and more. So we have to fight that trend, and it's not going to be easy to fight it. And the solution is indeed, as Bronwyn says, to put more in the middle, to recognize the benefits of the mixed economy, which is we let the wonders of capitalism do as much as it can, but recognize that it does have these failure modes, including greater monopolies, greater transfer of wealth to the small number of successful organizations, and we have to take big steps to reverse that. And unless we do it, we could end up in increasingly bitter situations which are bad for all of us psychologically, and which might lead it to all manner of uprisings, such as we're just beginning to see, perhaps with some of the rather angry rebellions on the streets. They could just be a foretaste of much worse to come, unless we seriously address this issue.
Thank you, David. Rohit.
Well, just picking up on David's last point about listening to the anger on the streets, I think that in the same way as the real challenge for governments and corporations today around the Black Lives Matter movement is not to take a lot of action, but to do a lot of listening, and to actually understand those who feel like they've been underserved and really understand what their needs are and to act on that. I think the same thing is very true around global poverty and the shape of the global middle class. And I think where we sit today in the luxury of sort of developed economies, it's very hard for us to understand what the middle class looks like or what poverty looks like in other parts of the world. And to truly understand what it's like to live where literally you are earning that day what you're going to eat that day. And if you don't earn, you don't eat. And being middle class means you can earn enough to know that you can eat for that week. You know, the definitions are different. And I think that lack of understanding is critical. And the big concern I have at the moment is that the major trade deals that are being signed around the world really aren't paying much attention to the issues around poverty. In the past, we've talked about trade as being a great enabler of economic leveling up. It's been a mechanism to create jobs, bring prosperity, but I see nothing in the bones of the trade deals that we're discussing, for example, with the US, that talk at all about poverty in the UK. And certainly I don't see anything in the discussion of Britain's trade deals with other nations that's tied to helping them bring people out of poverty. And we had DFID, you know, it's now part of this new department, but you know, it had a role to play. But I wonder whether we can maintain attention for long enough to make real change for the world's poor, and what happens if we don't. And it feels to me at the moment like the gap is growing. The distance between what people are thinking about and the real issues of those in need seems to be growing. We see lots of good examples of point initiatives, but I don't feel like we're really harnessing global capability. I don't feel like we're harnessing global intellect, and I certainly don't feel like we're harnessing global wealth and capability to really tackle some of those deep systemic issues that have been laid bare during this pandemic and are likely to get worse before they get better.
Thanks, Rohit. Geoff, what are your thoughts?
I'd agree with much of that, but perhaps to throw in a couple of slightly different angles. So there's no doubt the crisis so far has had a very uneven effect by social class and to a degree by race, and very starkly in some countries. But I think the next wave of effects will be much more complicated than they may appear. I mean, in the first place, I think it's quite hard generalizing on the economic effects because so much depends on sector. So some sectors are doing fairly well, and it's not just the Zoom sectors. I mean, where I live, actually, construction and retail are probably have maintained revenue better than the sort of Zoom workers. I think there's definitely very bad effects for young people leaving education in the next couple of years. Always, if you leave in a recession, your life chances are significantly impaired. We're undoubtedly going to see an acceleration of automation and AI for all sorts of reasons in the next couple of years compared to what would have happened otherwise. But I think it's unclear whether this crisis will actually further increase inequality. The last crisis didn't. I mean, many people thought it would, but it turned out not to. So it's always important to look at the facts, not sort of overly sweeping generalizations. And my guess is in some parts of the world, particularly South Asia, big countries of South Asia, actually the fact that they're being forced to put into place large-scale income support systems is actually accelerating their move to the kind of welfare states which other parts of the world take for granted, which on balance will probably be quite good for the poor seen in the long view. So a crisis which is definitely very unequal in its short-term impacts may not be in its longer-term impacts.
Thanks very much indeed, Geoff. So let's have a look at the poll results. So we can see there that in response to the question, which groups are likely to do best economically in the next 2 years, that venture capital and early stage science and technology inventors, which from my point of view doesn't necessarily feel terribly different from what we're used to seeing. Bronwyn, any particular response to what you see there in the poll?
Well, I think that justifies really a lot of what we've been looking at, just definitely in the work that I do about the effects of financial socialism. That's where your policies are definitely skewed towards injecting capital into markets, which generally finds its way into financial assets and into speculative assets, and not necessarily trickling down as much as some of these policies are supposed to happen. And we've definitely seen that if you look at what's happening on the stock markets across the world, where the cash is ending up, where things are going up and where things are going down. So I don't think that's difficult to argue with, particularly in a Western, weird, developed setting. Of course, as Geoff was saying, they're definitely going to be very different effects going on in different countries around the world. The world is not a homogeneous place by any stretch of the imagination, and the differences are vast.
Thank you for that perspective. I just want to pick up on one question that we've had in. I apologize that we're not able to get through some of the questions that we have. I'm trying to link them to the discussion that we're having, but I think the discussion from the panelists is really very interesting. But there's one question here from Sadia Tariq, who asks, can we have social culture without mental culture? Can we separate social culture from the mental culture? Which is repeating the first point there. Isn't the individual mental culture of a president and other power holders an important critical factor? So I suppose, what's the difference between those in power and perhaps those that might be subject to the power?
I'm not sure exactly what the asker of that question was looking for in terms of a response there, but I suppose that sure, yes, leadership does dictate a lot of what happens in the different countries that we sit in, and the tone that those leaders set does definitely influence the general mental state of that population. The people say in New Zealand might be slightly more chuffed with their leadership than perhaps people in where I live in South Africa or in the United States. It's never fair to pick on America alone when people in glass houses like myself shouldn't throw too many stones at the various different leadership styles going on around the place. But I think that when it comes to things like mental health and that mental well-being and that perspective that you approach challenges in, I think that really is very individual. And I think that it's completely possible to have very resilient communities even within a very dysfunctional state. And I think that really depends on what sorts of community setting you have around yourself and how much agency your smaller community has. And then once again, how much that community defers to the state to solve their problems. So I'm always a fan of local governance, and rather than necessarily centralized top-down governance, one solution for everyone. I think that when it comes to anything in the future space, and definitely when it comes to the future of nations and the world at large, we need more options, not less, going forward. And I don't think that we should be deferring to leadership for our mental state.
Well, Bronwyn, thank you very much for that. There's not time to answer this question. We probably need a whole webinar for it, but I'm just going to leave this particular question hanging. And the question was, democracy has failed and brought in mediocre leaders. What should replace it? You see why I think that might need a whole webinar on its own. So thank you for the question, but we probably reserve that for another time. So at this stage, I'd like to hand the stage over to Geoff Mulgan. Geoff, whose chapter in the book, Using the Crisis to Remake Government for the Future, is a really great chapter, as are all the chapters that we have in the book. And Geoff, we're really interested to hear your perspective that underpins your chapter. So the floor's yours.
Well, thanks, Steve. And I'll pick up actually on a few of the points Bronwyn and David and Rohit made earlier. So yeah, my chapter is looking at what might this mean for the medium and slightly longer term future of government. And I just emphasize what Bronwyn said. The world is a very uneven place, and in terms of the effects of crises, they can, for a society and a government, be damaging and lead to essentially as a retreat. They can be homeostatic, that's to say all efforts just get put into getting back to where you were before, or they can be transformative. And I think we'll probably see all three of those effects amongst the 200 plus countries across the world. If you don't already, it's worth keeping track of John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times, who I think has done an actually extraordinary job of documenting the data on COVID right across the world and making it quite accessible. So I'm not going to talk through this diagram, but it does, again, reinforce this point that the world is experiencing this crisis in very, very uneven ways. Some countries with a remarkable success in containing it so far, some pretty disastrous. That picture may look different after wave 2 and 3 by the end of the year, but at the moment the patterns of success are striking. So countries like New Zealand, Taiwan, Vietnam, and many others doing extraordinarily well, and others like much of the US, the UK, Brazil doing in some ways extraordinarily badly given their capabilities and what you'd expect their infrastructures to be capable of. What we have seen everywhere is in some ways a reassertion of big government with both the good and bad aspects that brings. This is the Leviathan picture from Hobbes. Imposing quarantines, huge lockdowns, massive income support, business support, social mobilization. These are unprecedented outside wartime. And I think there is a pattern, and again, Bronwyn, I think, said a little bit of this. The pattern isn't by regime type. It's not as if democracies have done much better than authoritarian dictatorships or the other way around, though people did start saying that at one point. There's no pattern of that kind. But there has been, I think, quite a striking pattern where leadership style has had a big influence on how well the crisis has been contained. And crudely speaking, leadership's willing to use expertise, knowledge, data, with an ability to partner with their society. I'll say a little bit more about this, have done much better than those perhaps a little bit too intoxicated with their own rhetoric. For me, and I say this in the chapter, one of the really interesting things is what this crisis will do to how governments think, how they act a little bit more like brains of societies. Now that can be a bit of a bad thing if you rely just on the leader's brain, and that leader then not only recommends disinfectant as the cure for COVID, but I don't know if you saw Trump last night in Tulsa. He had this wonderful set of lines where he said, the problem when you do testing is you find cases. And that's why I've told my people to do less testing. So we find less cases, and you sort of have to despair. I mean, how can satire keep up when you have leaders like that. I mean, there's another sort of version of the leader's brain, which is, you know, the use of the crisis to strengthen coercive power over the people. And quite a few countries have used that. It always happens in both semi-democracies and in dictatorships. Any crisis will be used as an excuse for squeezing out dissent. And we've seen a bit of that from Hungary to Hong Kong. For me, what's more interesting is how this crisis is pointing to a future vision of much more shared intelligence, where governments and their societies share their data, their models of the world, their predictions, their analyses, all the things you see listed there in what I call a collective intelligence. We've seen this around the models. So I think the fact there are all these competing models about what might happen on the health side, the economic side, is for me a healthy future where almost any part of government is openly interrogating multiple models which try to predict the future. And interestingly, in some countries like Germany, the scientists have been all the time communicating outwards to the public as well as communicating inwards into government, and much more sophistication about science being nuanced, complex, contradictory, rather than what some politicians still do and say, oh, we're following the science as if it's singular. It's not singular, and it never will be on any important challenges. A huge variety of technical capabilities in use of digital technologies from countries like Korea, where they managed to mobilize mobile phone data, credit card data, tracing of all kinds. Taiwan, even further with its extraordinary range of digital fences, quarantines, tracing tools. Singapore did Trace Together right from the beginning of the crisis, which the UK has just monumentally cocked up with its attempt months too late to have its own tracing app, which will be, I'm sure, the subject of an inquiry. And of course, China, which screwed up the crisis at the beginning, then has in fact handled it incredibly well subsequently, and put in place these systems of red, green, yellow through Alibaba and Tencent and others, which I think points to what all the rest of the world will need in a few months' time, when there is more reliable antibody testing and a need to have a very sophisticated handling of different populations, some of whom have already, are already immune, some of whom haven't caught it and are vulnerable, some of whom haven't caught it and are not very vulnerable. So we'll see this, I think population segmentation will be a big part of the story for the next year and a half ahead of a vaccine. And that requires sophisticated government capability, which is missing in some places. Interestingly, some countries which probably wouldn't have expected to be in the rank of the Taiwans and the Estonias have done very well, or are doing well, like Bangladesh, which has a sophisticated collective data intelligence system trying to point to this future kind of shared brain system. Now, I've described this in my book, Big Mind, and a lot of the work I do with governments now around the world. How do you orchestrate these different things in a coherent way together? And perhaps I'm a little bit biased in thinking that this crisis will greatly accelerate our understanding of why this kind of shared intelligence is so critical, not just for pandemics, but also for economic recovery and things like climate change. Interestingly, I think it nearly always requires not just big government, which on its own can be collectively stupid, but different ways of partnering with society. And again, we've seen in the last few months extraordinary innovation around this. In the UK, for example, use of platforms like Good Sam for mobilizing hundreds of thousands of volunteers in the health service. All over the world, sort of people bricolaging together different elements of tech to manage food supplies or visits and so on, and the creation of entirely new infrastructures around care and support for the elderly. In the bottom left, you see one of many, many platforms doing that, using social media platforms, but not for just selling advertising, but for organizing care, much of which should have happened 10 years ago, but it's all been accelerated dramatically by the crisis. And again, I think that points us to a future vision of government where this is just the norm for doing almost anything, that there is open data, there are collective intelligence methods for finding solutions from entrepreneurs and communities, where evidence is orchestrated and shared in real time, etc., etc. These have been talked about for many years as the desirable future for government, but this crisis has accelerated them, and those countries which have done these things best have so far had much better results than those which didn't, which relied on non-evidence, non-sharing of data, and rhetoric. So for conclusion, in a way that the messages of this crisis for the future of government are in some ways very old-fashioned messages. They are that it's a good thing to have governments which are competent, which are full of experts who know what they're doing. That's an old-fashioned story, but it's probably one which needs to be relearned every now and again. And the brilliant Michael Lewis book on Trump, In Praise of Boring Bureaucrats, is worth reading if any of you haven't read it. As was said at the beginning, agility has been all important. Governments have had to move very, very fast, and often in partnership with a public who need to trust what his government is doing. We're already seeing these overlapping crises, and I think this will become even clearer in the next year or two: health, economic, social, and political. And because nobody knows what will happen in each one, it's requiring, I think, agility of a different order than perhaps classic agile government. And that is to say, I think it's experimentalism at very large scale is where we're moving, where governments will have to experiment with new kinds of income support or lockdown or lock time removals, but with the data coming back in real time. So they're becoming a bit more like actually what Amazon and Google do as a matter of course, with large scale A/B testing of everything in real time. I think that is where we're heading for government. And although they have no certainty on the time horizons of the crisis and its second and third order effects, I think there will be lasting lessons. The ways in which some countries have handled it well will set the tone for many others for 10, 20 years into the future. This is what has happened in the past with big crises and wars. They do tend to crystallize a different set of views about what government is about. And if nothing else, I think the kind of conventional wisdom of certainly the UK and America in the 70s, 80s and 90s, which was the neoliberal view that basically government was a bad thing. You wanted it as small and weak as possible so that people could live their lives to the full and markets can flourish. That now looks like a very, very anachronistic worldview, which hasn't weathered this crisis very well at all.
Geoff, thank you very much indeed. That's brilliant. Let me just launch your poll. So the question that we're posing in your poll is, what are the expectations of your national government in 5 years' time compared to the start of 2020? And again, this is multiple choice. So everyone, please have a look at that poll and tell us what you think. Before we go to the panel, actually, there's one question I wanted to pose to you, Geoff, and a lot of what you were saying just then was really kind of resonating with me. One of the questions that you pose for others to answer at the end of your chapter is, how might the societal response to the pandemic help enable a more human future? And a human future is the piece that really resonated strongly with me. And I just wondered what your 30 or 60 seconds thoughts were on that, answering your own question.
Well, I'll answer it in contradictory ways. So as I said earlier, I think one effect of this crisis, for both better and worse, will be accelerating investment in automation to replace people because of the costs of handling social distancing in factories, warehouses, restaurants, offices. All of these mean that investment is being speeded up, which isn't necessarily very good for human beings. But on the other side, I think in many countries there has been an extraordinary human response of mutual care and compassion and solidarity and support around looking after the most vulnerable elderly, around things like the food supplies I described, and in a way being reminded by the crisis that we have slightly lost sight often in our societies, overdriven perhaps by social media and consumption, about the more basic sort of human essentials of care and support for each other, rediscovering neighborhood, perhaps even rediscovering family. Whether that will last, I don't know, but I hope it does. And I hope that one lasting effect, if nothing else, of these crises is changing our thoughts about what really is essential. And indeed, who are essential workers? And certainly in the country I live in, and in much of the world, the people who are paid the most are often the least essential by any objective standards, and the people paid the least, who've turned out to be the vital people through the crisis, care workers, health workers, cleaners, supermarket cashiers, etc., are paid the least and have the lowest status. So I hope there'll be a little bit of a rethinking of that. There is nothing laid down in the law or the Bible which says in every society hedge funds and bankers should be paid far more than everyone else. Those have been social choices made over many years.
Excellent, lovely. Thanks for those thoughts, Geoff. So let me throw it open to the other panelists. Reflections on what Geoff's had to say?
I'll happily start. I'll just say every time I read this chapter, I'm excited by, every time I hear Geoff talk, I'm excited by the possibilities of, what we can do. And it really ties quite well with a lot of what David argues for. That if we can get to the point where we have a more enlightened government, we have more capable people in government, and we're investing continuously in the education of society, we can really start to make this collective intelligence ecosystem work for us in ways that are just beyond our imagination today, and could really help us start to tackle some of our biggest problems. When we talk about a food crisis, we don't actually have a food crisis, we have a food distribution crisis. And what we need to do is to tap into the collective intelligence of people across global food systems to understand why it is that 40% of all our fresh food gets wasted. Similarly, I think we talk about poverty, and we talk about the issue of, how do we get the money to the right places? And the UK set aside a budget of 0.7% of GDP for international aid, which I think is about £12 billion. Now, it turns out that DFID, our department handing out that aid, couldn't spend it, couldn't find enough suitable projects. We've come up with a structural solution to a process problem. What we need are smarter collective intelligence tools where we're gathering from on the ground, what are those projects where we could make the most difference? What are those areas where, it might be women's collectives, it might be street kids projects, how do we identify that where, or those projects where, the input of money could really make a difference in accelerating the skills of the entrepreneurs and their effectiveness. So, I think collective intelligence starts to help us solve a whole range of problems that we previously thought were intractable, and we tended to try and solve by just restructuring the organizations rather than actually rethinking the problem.
Thanks, Rohit.
Points I would add to that. I liked very much what I heard. I'm a big fan of Big Think. I think that's the name of Geoff's book. So after you have read Aftershocks and Opportunities, it's probably a good book to grab as well. Geoff mentioned large-scale experimentation, and I think he suggested this might be a bit different from the skills of Agile. I actually see large-scale experimentation in an effective way in which you can learn quickly which systems are more likely to work. That is part of the discipline of large-scale Agile. I mean, Agile started off as a mechanism for small software teams of about 7 people, but over the years it has grown in sophistication and capability, and there's now lots of people looking at large-scale Agile possibilities. The other thing I would highlight is there's 2 types of political decisions. One is when you decide on somebody based on their ideological purity or based on their leadership loyalty, versus you choose them because of their raw competence, and you choose them on their ability to get things done and ability to build bridges. So I'm very much hopeful that society as a whole is going to decide they want to vote for people with the competence and the bridge building capabilities rather than the ideological purity. We can't take that for granted, but we should demonstrate lots of examples where we can, looking at real facts rather than made up stories, of what the advantages are of more practical, effective politicians.
Thank you, David. Bronwyn.
Yeah, sorry. From my side, I think the missing link in a lot of those policy suggestions that you put together is trust. Because we don't get a better government, a stronger government. We can't implement policies that are very sort of widespread, like you're talking about all those track and trace things and all the rest of it, without a buy-in from society. And you don't impose that trust on society. That has to be something that comes from the bottom up. And I think that the evidence is completely around us, that particularly in the West, once again, in the developed world, there is pretty much no trust between the populace and their leaders at this point in time. I really can't think of many countries where there is that trust. Maybe New Zealand, if you want to throw it out there, if you're looking at the weird nations, once again, those Western, educated, developed side of the world. And I think that unless we're able to fix that trust, there's no way that those sort of utopian views of more financial socialism type policies can actually work going forward. So if you're looking at a bigger government, stronger government, more systems imposed, more trust that governments expect from their societies, but not necessarily delivering to their societies. Unless you fix that bridge, you can't really move forward. And I think the only way to fix that is to start with society once again, because government is an emergent phenomenon from society. It's not really the other way around. Society makes government, government does not make society. So I think that we have a lot of work to do at an individual level before any of that will really start to pay dividends off going into the future. And I think that we need to start with bridging those divides, like I was speaking about earlier, but at a much smaller level, a much more local level. If we are not able to get along with each other in our workplaces, in our streets, and in our societies, there's no way that you're going to get a healthy emergent government system out of that. Because what we have seen with democracy, how it's playing out at the moment, there was that question earlier about how do we fix democracy at this point in time? And we seem to be getting to a point where democracy doesn't scale when it is built on division. When people are elected by being the most radical, by being the most polarizing, by coming back to what David was saying, by being the best ideologue in the room, as opposed to being the best builders or the best man or woman for the job. And unfortunately, the way our political parties are structured in such a way that, you know, it really forces people into this binary yes or no, my team, your team kind of thing. We end up with governments that pretty much half the population at any given point in time distrusts completely. So I think the question is really, how do we fix that? How do we get to a point where people are recognizing the common good in the leadership? The leadership isn't there for half the population, for the people that won the last election cycle, but it's rather there for everyone. And I do think that there are roots coming out of that. I think that Taiwan has been mentioned before. They're much more collaborative governance systems that try to build consensus rather than feed into divisions, are much more healthy ways to look at the future if we want to get buy-in for trust-based systems, for things like track and trace, for things like information sharing and data sharing, and that building those bridges between private sector and public sector. You also first have to build the bridge across the divide, across the political divide. And I don't see a way to fix that unless we're able to get past the binary two-party political system that democracy has seemed to devolve into. And I'm sure there are system changes we could make that could start to point things in a more cohesive direction and less of a divisive direction going forward. But I think the work has to start there.
I guess with this particular panel, it's no great surprise with all these different kind of connections between everything we're talking about. And so far, every time we've asked a question, we've needed another webinar to answer it, really. Let me just share the results of Geoff's poll. Geoff, what's your response to those?
Well, can I just a couple of comments on the comments, as it were. Oops. Yeah, so I certainly agree with the points about trust. You can't run any of these collective intelligence tools of government without a degree of trust. In fact, though, if you look at trust data across the world, although we often assume there's been a long-term decline of trust, that's mainly because we look at the US. At a global level, there hasn't been any such decline. And in many countries, trust in government is pretty high, not just New Zealand. You mentioned Taiwan, much of East Asia, trust in government is at historically high levels, and indeed much of Northern Europe it is as well. So the key, I think, is those countries which do have bad problems of trust, and the US certainly has done, need to learn from the ones which have been much better at ways of running a society and dialogue and deliberation which build trust. And that may involve women. One of the questions on the chat was, you know, is there a pattern of women leaders doing better? There is a pattern. You can make of it what you want. I think the globally engaged point here, I think is striking in a way, because the pattern in the crisis has been the weakness of global institutions, which have done almost nothing. Almost everything has been done by national governments. And the ones I talk to are doing almost nothing even to learn from each other. Again, the cross-cutting regional bodies and global bodies have played a remarkably marginal role. My hope is that will change. And indeed, I, a few weeks ago, wrote a piece on what global government might look like and how this crisis might help accelerate us towards it. But it was really much more in the spirit Rohit was talking about, is not global government as a big monster, sort of Leviathan sitting on top of us with its army and its money and bossing people around. That is not a plausible vision, but a much more networked model of governance, which mobilizes technological capabilities on things like pandemics or climate change or food waste, is plausible. A global governance, which is much more focused on practical problem solving, is, I think, plausible. And we're already seeing bits of this happening around climate change, biodiversity, and other fields. And it's almost opposite to, as I say, what 100 years ago was assumed as the vision of global government, a bunch of usually old men sort of running things from a center. That's what sci-fi films show. But I think it is plausible. And if there's a shift of leadership in the US, the US, EU, China, others could all help the world move in this direction, even though at the moment it looks pretty hopeless. And the red line there, 64%, looks very unlikely from June 2020. But I think this could be one of the things which flips around, just as the crisis, of course, of the 30s and 40s, which, when global institutions were totally weak, in fact turned out to be the precursor to the creation of the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, and so on. That's my hope. I may be completely wrong on that.
Well, thank you very much indeed for those thoughts, Geoff. What I'm going to do is, there are a couple of questions that have come in, but I think they're fairly broad questions. So I think I'm tempted to kind of hold on to those until the last section, and we'll go through those sections. So we won't lose them, hopefully. We'll run through those questions later on, because they do, I think, draw a number of threads together. So what I'd like to do now is invite Rohit to the floor. Rohit, over to you.
Sorry, I'm not going to share slides at all. So I'm going to briefly share from two chapters that we wrote. One was about what can governments learn about from this situation, from Futurists in particular, and secondly, one about the economic recovery agenda. I'm not going to go through all 15 ideas across the two chapters. I'm just going to pick out a few that I think really resonate with the conversations we've had so far. And the first is this need for globally coordinated response mechanisms for crises. We've become more attuned now to the idea of this 1 in 100, 200 year crisis that we've had. And people are now willing to think about the fact that we might well have a proper crisis with climate change, with food, and some of the other things going on. And what we saw was that in the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, the reason that it ended was really massive coordination between the G7, G20, China, and a few other players really coming together to say we can't let a meltdown happen. As Geoff says, we've been horrible up to now in terms of the role of the global institutions, but also the role of nations. If anything, we've undermined their power. And this virus travels around the world in Seat 47C. It is an aircraft-borne virus or a ship-borne virus. And until we've eradicated it everywhere, we haven't really dealt with it anywhere. Because as New Zealand found out last week, you know, you can say you've declared an end to the virus locally, but then 2 Brits come in and bring it back like this gift from overseas. And so I think one of the first challenges is really, there's a lot of hope riding on the Biden presidency, if you like. If Biden gets the presidency, he might well try and reintegrate with the world and try and influence the change in global institutions, but in a much more gentle way than Trump. But we need something. We need someone to show leadership in the way that, to extent Gordon Brown did. So the first thing is this idea that these massive global challenges really require globally coordinated solutions. You might act differently locally, but you want to have common response mechanisms. You want to have common communication. You want to have a shared understanding of the science and the policy options. The second one is really that the countries that seem to have done best have that mechanism for horizon scanning, scenario planning, risk assessment, contingency planning, and how to turn that into strategy with continuous learning in it. And Taiwan keeps getting held up, Singapore keeps getting held up, and both of them have acknowledged that it was their horizon scanning of weak signals coming out of China that let them act at the very earliest signs of the whistleblower to start kicking into place. Not, well, what should we do about this, but what are the mechanisms we've already created in order to respond? So I think really emphasizing the role of those capabilities and really building them into governments as a core capability. That then leads to what does that capability look like? And we talk a lot about this in the book, and a lot of people talk about this. And we had a bit of a discussion earlier about how much distributed capability do you need? And this isn't a case of building up in every hospital enough protective equipment for the next 10 years or enough ventilators. This is about thinking about how do we distribute both the management capability to local areas and the resources so that you can coordinate between the players, whether it's healthcare, environmental emergencies, food distribution issues, and that you have people who are really good at that planning, those technocrats, whether they're coming from the military or elsewhere, who know what to do in a crisis and who aren't making it up as they go along and then changing their mind on a continuous basis. And we all know what we're talking about here, but this is about really recognizing that resilience does require redundancy and a distributed system. The next is, we talked about Germany sharing the science on a regular basis. And I think the challenge here is governments need to get into the habit of communicating scientific information on a regular basis, rather than waiting till there's a crisis. And then you've got an emotional overload already, and you're trying to get some complex scientific concepts in place. You're trying to explain that we need to look at a range of models and all the rest of it. So actually making it a matter of course for government to be sharing key scientific information, the models, the different scientific perspectives, and why the assumptions are changing. And there are some very good examples out there. So Finland, for example, and this is now over 2 years old, but Finland, picked up from its horizon scanning that AI wasn't going away. And they created this online tutorial program, 6 modules, to teach the entire Finnish population about artificial intelligence. It's called The Elements of AI. It's free and available to anyone. But their view was, this is how you educate the population. This is how you get new science into the conversation. You provide the tools so that when it comes to, in that case, people losing their jobs to technology or having to reskill, they already understand the why and the what of AI, and therefore they're better able to respond rather than putting their hand up and saying, no, I don't want that. We've already talked about this, the importance of learning and after action review, but I think that's something that really needs to become a core competency that we actually need to teach in schools, to teach people how to learn from a situation, gather the data, make objective decisions, revisit what your objective was, and then refine your plan, and not filter everything through how might this look if we announce a change of direction in the media. So those are the kind of quick ones, and I'm speeding through this because I'm conscious of time, but those are kind of a few of the things that futurists have been talking about for a long time to government, about how you prepare for the future, how you embed that into process, and how you turn good futures thinking into good strategy, into good executable action. And it's interesting that the Millennium Project, that's been sort of on its knees for 20 years, trying to get people to fund incredibly good work, is now a hugely in-demand organization with no end of projects being offered to it to explore the emerging future. And it is running the project for the American Red Cross on, what does this pandemic look like and how could it play out? So, and they have their 15 grand challenges. They have their version of a collective intelligence system. So they've had these mechanisms in place, and the mechanisms for dialogue, for global engagement. And I think maybe their time has come, which could be a good thing. On the economic front, I'm just going to pick on two. And we've touched on this a lot with Bryony's point, that it's hidden from a lot of people as to how weak and fragile and economically unstable a lot of countries are around the world. How their debt mountain is really, about to engulf them, and what the other side looks like is ugly and painful. There's a lot of talk around the world about a new Marshall Plan, new funding, eradication of debt. I think this time round it has to be very different. Whatever that plan looks like, it has to be broken down to the level of what are the bedrocks here? What are the institutions we need? What are the institutional capabilities? What are the societal skills and mechanisms? How do we build up the capacity for job creation, for SMEs to become sustainable, and not kind of pouring it in at the top, but really building up at the lower level, and maybe new models. A lot of the money in the past has been funded or channeled via the World Bank, the IMF, other institutions, the International Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and there's a friction loss there. There's an energy loss in those systems. And the evaluation reports are often quite scary in terms of, what were the results of the money that went in. And we discover that a lot of the money is siphoned off, not siphoned off, but ends up being paid off to consultants en route. We need different models now where maybe we start to partner countries up, where the countries that seem to have good and robust systems actually partner. So, maybe Finland takes on Syria and partners Syria and says, we will be your direct partner in building capability, helping you build systems, creating accountability. It's a great way of developing our own leaders as well, because they'll go in and work in your institutions and we'll do real skills transfer. But we need new models. We need new thinking for how you help countries navigate through this. And we need new conversations about what are the right measures for this? What do we do about debt? And how do we help these countries build 5 to 50-year plans? Because we can't keep doing this within the electoral cycles of the donor nations. Which takes me to the final one that I just want to talk about very briefly, which is prior to the pandemic, when we looked around the world, particularly in the Middle East, some African countries, some Central European countries, were really quite proud of their national economic development plans, which had, bold crests and were looking out 10, 20, 30 years, often based on an investment in science and technology, but often based on the notion of global supply chains and largely ignoring the impact of climate change or health risks. I think those need revisiting now, and a lot of countries need to start thinking about what happens if we can't do things the same way in the future, if we have to develop our own capabilities more. And I think we've broken it down into 3 time periods. The next 2 years being about really building up local resilience, building up manufacturing capability in things like protective equipment, building up small footprint factory solutions, building local skills and capability, and then starting the R&D in the industries that you might want to invest in on a 3 to 5 year timescale, and building up the IP partnerships with the manufacturers who might then bring their plants in. We're seeing this, and Jerry Edling in the book talks about the idea of global innovation chains, where we move from having long supply chains to having global innovation chains where we partner with local players who build small footprint factories locally to deliver. And so I think there's a lot of focus on that in the 3 to 5 year timescale to build that up. And then the kind of 5 to 10 year timescale is all about transforming our nations, building up, really taking advantage of these new fields of science and technology, so that rather than seeing certain countries and companies as being the owners of all this and the source of all this, you can actually do a lot more locally. If these are truly abundance technologies, then there's no reason why a Lesotho, a Ras Al Khaimah, or a Sri Lanka shouldn't have some local capability in these things, rather than being reliant on very potentially disrupted global supply chains. So that's one of those are two of the economic ones. But I didn't want to go through everything, but hopefully that makes some sense, that this is all about building new capabilities for the future now, building new ways of thinking, and building new visions of how you create long-term economic viability and a more inclusive economy.
Rohit, thank you. That was an incredible summary of two pretty complex chapters from the book. So thank you very much for that. Let's launch your poll. There we go. So the final poll, excuse me, this evening. What are the most critical lessons governments should learn in terms of preparedness for future shocks? You can see the options down there. It's multiple choice again. So while you're looking at that and identifying which of those options you think are important, let me go back to the panel. Who'd like to have a go at responding to some of the issues that Rohit spoke about?
Well, maybe just to throw in one, and I agree with everything he said. The one opportunity of the next year or two is if a lot of people are out of work, on furlough. A lot of jobs are going to go probably in the second or third phase of the pandemic, which appeared to survive early on, and not just in SMEs, but also in large companies. And that means lots of people with time to learn something. So I think we will see many governments putting in place large-scale programs of retraining, of additional kind of subsidies for full university degrees, short-term degrees, vocational degrees, you name it, partly to keep people active and to counter what otherwise are the damaging effects of lack of opportunities early on in career. So what I'm looking for in the next few months is to see which countries are ahead of the curve in seeing this capability issue as, in some ways, a great opportunity, and combining online and offline MOOCs of all forms to try and use this period for almost a shock treatment of capability, paralleling the kind of economic shock treatments and health ones we're more familiar with.
Thanks, Geoff. Bronwyn, David?
I suppose just on that, just what came out of the news this last week in terms of governments, how they're going to relook at how to deploy funds for education to kickstart economies and to look ahead to the future. I thought it was quite interesting that Australia seems to be quite a contrarian there, and they've just announced that they are defunding their humanities departments, and they are putting more funding that's coming out from the humanities departments towards STEM fields. So I don't know how other panelists feel about that, but I think that seems to be quite a contrarian move based on what other governments are definitely looking at, because we definitely are moving, despite my personal feelings about it, we're definitely moving into a much more Keynesian way of looking at economies. We are definitely heading for much more government involvement, for new deals coming out of pretty much every country. But I suppose the question then becomes where that cash is deployed, and if that cash is deployed to keep people merely busy, or if it's going to be deployed in such a way that it's actually going to increase future growth going ahead. Because I think that one of the other issues that we've started to see from your more developed and emerged markets is that there seems to be perhaps almost getting to a point where we've had more education than the market is able to absorb. So you almost have to have the development of industry going ahead at the same time as your development of degree production. So I know that there are lots of degreed young people, very well educated, that are unable to find a space in the economy. So you've got this massive mismatch there. So I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on how to bridge that gap, because you obviously need to be building industry up at the same time as you are educating people. Otherwise you have very unhappy, very uneducated people, which is not particularly stabilizing for long-term stability in a society. In fact, having an unemployed, educated population is probably about the most dangerous thing you can do if you're looking far ahead at stability being a goal, and equality and growth and all of those good things.
I have virtual cans of worms all over the floor of my office at the moment. This is there's not enough hours in the day, are they? David, what are your thoughts?
Well, this is such a rich discussion. And I really like the emphasis upon improving the mechanisms of government, improving the institutions that are around, improving the tools. But perhaps there's something missing. And whilst this discussion was going on, I've been reminded of the work of perhaps the leading scholar of change in the world of business. He's a Harvard professor called John Kotter. He has a marvelous analysis on the main reason why change initiatives fail. Most attempts to change the culture of a company or change what they're doing get bogged down. And he lists 8 reasons, as I remember, why these change initiatives fail. But I'm only going to talk about the top 2. Number 1 is lack of a sufficient sense of urgency. People say, yeah, it's not quite right here, but we're sort of too busy to address it, and this doesn't seem that urgent really. We'll come back to it some other day. So lack of a sense of urgency. And second, lack of a clear vision of a practical solution. Unless we can offer people a compelling vision of how we can get from the present bad situation into a better situation, a much better situation ideally, then there's all kinds of psychological and sociological pressures which are going to lead people not to engage and take their eye off the ball, despite all the education that's been given. So perhaps the most important thing that we practitioners of foresight can do is to clarify more credibly and more compellingly the bad things that are going to happen unless we make these social and individual changes, but also the very much better future that could happen. And that transcendent vision of a better future, that's often what's motivated great changes in society. Some of the bad changes as well, of course, if you look at the religious wars and so forth. But if we can truly identify the ways in which humans can reach higher levels of experience, equality, liberty, as a result of taking full advantage of this technologies of the 4th Industrial Revolution, that might spark much greater energy being put into this area and make the change initiatives succeed rather than getting bogged down and distracted.
Thank you very much indeed for that, David. Let's have a look at the results of your poll, Rohit, and we'll get your responses to that. I'm imagining that given the likely audience here today, that develop horizon scanning scenarios, risk assessments, not much of a surprise that that comes out top. What surprises you and what doesn't surprise you in those results?
I'm hugely disappointed that no one thinks we should announce our world-beating track and trace system before we built it. But maybe we'll learn from that. I think it's inevitable that the audience is quite future focused. So people are, supporting many of the things I would agree. And the one that I was surprised at was this issue of emergency powers. I don't think we fully appreciate how much power governments have taken in this period and how quickly they've done it, and how little transparency there's been in what they've done. And actually there's nothing in those Emergency Powers Acts that couldn't be sorted out in peacetime, because it doesn't really matter what the crisis is. You're just saying you want to give government mechanisms to distribute money, mobilize the armed forces, reallocate resources, have extra powers for the police. You can do all that when you're not in crisis. And then you can have a much more robust debate about that and make sure that the powers are well structured and that you've got mechanisms for rolling them back over time. So I'm surprised, but I think the others, there isn't really a surprise there. I think everyone's been bitten by, well, not everyone, but a lot of countries have been bitten by just how bad our governments have been at dealing with the crisis, and how many of them appear to be not only making it up as they go along, but then not learning from each set of mistakes to refine the next set of crisis decisions. And so that is worrying. And maybe we need to put governments, ministers, and or all politicians, before they take office, after they get elected, maybe they should have 2 weeks of just going through training with the military and other people on how to do things, so that they understand more of this stuff and there's a common language, because this cuts across party divides. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Rohit. Very interesting. In the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the questions that we have that are unanswered, and I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity to answer one question. We've not really time for too much debate at the moment, but there are some really interesting questions that have been posed, and I want to make sure that we get through as many of those as we can in the next 10 minutes. So the first question I'd like to address, where's it gone? There it is. And this came up quite a while ago from Max Ramsahoy, and he asked, as opposed to the short-term 1 to 3 or 5 to 10 year timescale, what are the long-term effects of the pandemic over the course of the 21st century? First to put their hand up can answer that. The floor is yours, David.
You're muted, David.
Most people tend to assume that on the longer term, the pandemic will be a kind of a bump in the road and it's not going to change things too dramatically. But I think we should look at possible larger scale consequences of the pandemic. We should look at really bad things that could happen as well as really good things that can happen. And I'll just have time probably for the really bad thing that could happen, which is that if there is a resurgence of cases, if there is economic consequences affecting some countries, if there is criticism of some world leaders, what might these world leaders do? They might go off on overseas adventuring. This is a tried and tested path in people distracting from their own incompetence. And there are ways in which this could turn out badly. There could be incidents involving Iran, which also seems to be having a second wave coming up on it. Incidents involving the President of the United States, incidents involving the tensions on the Korean border. So in a time of crisis, some of these other sparks can suddenly get much worse. A little bit like the shot that rang around the world in 1914 in Sarajevo triggered other forces. So we should be especially alert to these consequences. And if we're not careful, there's a small probability, but it's still not to be discounted. We could end up in a horrendous military conflict as a result of failing to manage this situation today. So let's raise our awareness of that too.
Lovely, thank you, David.
Maybe not so lovely, but I know what you mean.
No, indeed. Well, it's hard to get a group of futurists together and not have some dystopia. So thank you for bringing that to the table, David. So another question here, and actually I think I'm going to ask Geoff to look at this one. The question from Monica Gross is, do governments really have the strength to change policies and direct them to social benefits without risking international investment?
I'm not totally sure I understand the premise of the question, but let me attempt an answer. So the one thing I slightly disagree with what Rohit said is that if you actually look at the data on how countries have performed through this crisis in terms of excess deaths, it's a slide I showed right at the beginning, many countries have actually done remarkably well, faced with a completely novel global threat. And in many of those countries, the public think they've done pretty well too. Their popularity has risen, not fallen. And they've been able to reconcile actually quite a lot of social support and for people, lockdown, with keeping the economy alive. And my guess is those countries will remain pretty attractive to international investors as they were in the past. The countries which will be less attractive will be the ones which look like they haven't got a grip on it, which look like they'll be chaotic for years to come, look like they have leaders who've lost the trust of the public, which will mean a jittering series of ongoing crises, and probably, as was just said, looking for distractions, either enemies within or without. So in that sense, I think actually good government is being rewarded already now in terms of the facts, and probably will be rewarded in terms of investment, trade, and so on in the near future as well. That looks more likely than the opposite.
Thanks for those thoughts, Geoff. Bronwyn, here's one for you, I think. Monica Gross again has said, globalization has taken the world to be influenced by multinational corporations, even with more economic power than governments. Aren't they, the multinationals, the ones responsible to think or lead future events and developments? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd say that's up to you as a consumer, right? So which companies are you going to support? Those are the ones that's, if you can be a shareholder in any of those companies and you can influence that policy, if enough people agree with you, it's essentially the same as voting for a government, right? So in theory, that could happen. I think a more interesting thing, the phenomenon that's happening as we sort of go out of 2020, looking a bit further ahead into sort of geopolitics and the lines that are being drawn, we definitely see new lines being drawn between different geographic alliances, between new international institutions, like we were talking about earlier. We've definitely seen that, say, perhaps the World Health Organization did not deal with things in perhaps the best way. And there are definitely rumors now that, of course, if the US splits from that, what new institutions are going to emerge to replace that, which geographic powers are going to be in control of those new institutions, and what new trading blocks are going to form. But I think from a futures perspective, I think it's quite interesting when we come back to corporates and we start seeing that the corporate trade lines being drawn are quite different from the national geographic lines being drawn in terms of alliances. So for me, I definitely find it very interesting how a lot of your massive Western tech companies, your really big farm companies, are starting to actually align themselves with, say, China's views on the world and submitting to Chinese orthodoxy rather than, say, American orthodoxy. And for me, that's quite interesting. I think that's a different fissure that we're starting to see in society as you've got these massive companies. In fact, I think that even back in 2018, if you just take those massive Western tech stocks, they would have been the third largest economy in the world. So if they start to form different alliances to the geography they come from, the national official border, you've suddenly got different power balances in play. It almost becomes a 3D geopolitics game rather than a 2D playing field that you start dealing with. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see those massive multinationals, just due to their size and weight, actually dictating different trade routes, different alliances that might be very different from what their political supposed allies in their natural geographies are perhaps leaning towards. So I think that's going to be quite interesting. We're definitely going to see conflict developing along those vertical and horizontal axes.
Thanks very much for those thoughts, Bronwyn. And finally, in this section, Solera Green has asked, futurists seem to be extremely well informed, read possibilities for renewing our societies and governments. Is there any action being taken by futurists collectively to ensure their contribution as a collective to national and global renewal? That's for you, Rohit.
I'm not aware of everything that's going on. The big thing I'm aware of is the Millennium Project, which has nodes in 80 countries. It is doing various real-time Delphis on different issues at the behest of various governments and other global institutions. So there is a demand for this kind of collective, assembling of ideas from futurists. But, you put three futurists in the room, you give them one question to discuss, and you will have at least 36 different answers. We don't all speak with one voice. You have very different views of what a futurist is, from a super forecaster through to a scenario planner. And so I think there's also a difficulty there. A lot of the institutions that have been around in futures for a while, will continue to get funding and work, but I'm not sure any of them are pushing to create big global collaborations. And I'm not really aware of any government reaching out in a big way to say, this is a great time for us to bring in the futurists. We're in the midst of a crisis. What do they think? I don't know. I'm not seeing it. I know corporates are, we're doing a lot of presentations to corporate boards and things about the scenarios. And I know a lot of the other contributors to the book are doing a lot of that kind of stuff. Geoff might be in a better position to talk about, what he's seeing in terms of governments pulling it together. But I think maybe we're just a bit too early, that people think that we're going to get out of this sometime this year, and it's just a case of toughing it out, and they haven't quite worked out that, you know, how deep the problem will be if we have a second and third peak, you know, both socially and economically, but, you know, politically as well. And I think mentally, you know, that the impact on society is going to be massive. And maybe there'll be a point where there's some deeper conversation about, can we get some futurist insight into this? There's a lot of behavioral economist insight being fed in, behavioral scientist insights being fed in. You know, any scientist with anything to do with modeling and epidemiology seems to be involved in either an official or an unofficial committee, but I'm not aware of many futurists being called in. I know the UK government created a lot of call-off contracts for futures research, and as I understand it, none of those have been issued, and they haven't seen this as an opportunity to put calls out in relation to this project, in relation to this crisis.
Thanks for those thoughts, Rohit. So I'm really conscious of time. We're just approaching 8 o'clock. Just before I hand over to Rohit, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, a really big thank you to all those people that signed in tonight, that have posed questions. I know there's been lots of chat going on as well. So I want to thank you all for coming along, and I hope you enjoyed it. It was certainly a very rich discussion. All these webinars have been very rich discussions, and you know, the big take home for me is just the sheer connectedness of all these issues. And the pandemic really seems to have almost been a catalyst for us to think about lots of other really critically important issues. And obviously, one other group I'd really like to thank Geoff, to thank Bronwyn, Rohit, and David for their wonderful insights this evening. And I'm really grateful for your patience with me and for the answers and the debate that you've given. So a big thank you for me. And I'd just like to hand over to Rohit to bring the webinar to a close. Rohit, over to you.
Thank you. Let's see if we can make the slide this time. Let's go. Right, just two things to get your cameras out for. Firstly, let's get this on screen. Yeah, as said, if you want to get on our free mailing list, email Carolina. We did something for the Recovery Summit last week where I tried to put together some of the ideas. God knows why this is on show. Anyway, have a look at that video. We've mailed it out in a million different ways. It gives you a kind of amalgam of a lot of the different ideas. And then if you haven't bought the book on you already, buy it for everyone you know, buy it for your children for when they grow up to read. Just make sure that you give it as gifts to everyone from now, forevermore. But thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Steve, for moderating today. And we'll release you all back into the community to enjoy whatever time you have left for the day. Thank you.